Hello and welcome to my channel, Rhino here. Today I'm looking at Bible Flockbox's video called 10 Undeniable Facts That Prove God is Real. Yes, James, I saw your comment. This one's a bit of a longer one, so I'll take it in at least 2 parts, maybe 3, so without further ado, on to part 1.
Does God exist, or is he just an imaginary sky fairy that religious people like to believe in because it helps them cope in life?
Well, my money's on the Sky Fairy, but I am intellectually honest enough to admit that we can never be completely sure, unless the all-knowing, all-powerful creator of the universe who wants us to believe in him actually does something that he knows will convince everyone to believe in him. And before you cry, but free will though, ask yourself this question. Does Satan have free will? Because if God can't make us believe in him without still allowing free will, then Satan, who definitely knows for sure that God exists, can't have free will, which means that everything Satan does is God's will. Just think about that for a moment. If everything Satan does is God's will, and Satan is the cause of all humanity's problems, then God wills humanity to have all of its problems, going right back to the initial eating of the forbidden fruit, which means that God didn't want us to have the idyllic life he set up for us. He wanted billions of people to go to hell for not believing in him after this idyllic life was ruined. Is that a God that you want to worship and thank for everything?
God definitely exists, and I don't want you to just take my word for it. Instead, in this video, I'm going to present to you 10 undeniable facts that prove God is real.
We shall see just how undeniable these facts are.
Let's get right into it. Fact number 1. Bible prophecy proves the existence of God. If there is a God, and he is omniscient as the Bible claims he is, then he would know the future.
Yes he would. Which makes it all the more interesting when the Bible says that God has regrets. Like in Genesis 6:6, where he regretted making humans. Or in 1 Samuel 15:11, where God regrets having made Saul king because Saul wasn't quite genocidal enough for God's liking. You'd think a being who can see the future would be able to do things that he won't regret later. Unless, of course, humans are to God as potato chips are to me. I can eat a full bag of potato chips knowing full well that I will regret it later. So, doing things badly with humans is God's guilty pleasure that he knows he will regret. So either God doesn't know the future, or he is able to give in to temptation knowing that giving in will cause future problems.
The Lord even said in Isaiah chapter 42 verse 9, "Behold, the former things are come to pass, and new things do I declare. Before they spring forth, I tell you of them."
Yes, the Bible does claim that the God of the Bible knows the future. But that's not very convincing. I mean, any fortune teller will make the same claim. Making the claim is no good without anything to back it up. And unless it's incredibly specific, it's not very convincing. And I don't recall that many specific prophecies in the Bible, though there are a few that I do remember that didn't come true, like when Egypt was supposed to be a desolate wasteland for 40 years and not a single person would set foot in it for that time period. There has never been such a time in Egypt's history, but I suppose it could be said that this one just hasn't come true yet, as there isn't really a time frame given. But the very next prophecy in Ezekiel 26:16-21 says that Nebuchadnezzar would conquer Egypt, which definitely didn't happen. There are more that I'm not going to get into here, but I'll leave a link to the Rational Wiki page on failed prophecies down below.
Since God said he can predict the future, then we can expect to find prophecies about the future in the Bible. And indeed we do. For example, in the book of Daniel chapter 2, we are given an outline of the rise and fall of world-ruling empires, even to modern times.
That's a pretty vague prophecy, but I'll wait until you start to get into it so I can respond piece by piece.
In Daniel chapter 2, King Nebuchadnezzar had a dream of a statue made of 4 metals. It had a head of gold, chest and arms of silver, a belly and thighs of bronze, legs of iron, and feet, part of iron and part of clay. When the prophet Daniel gave the interpretation of the king's dream, he said in verses 37-39, "You, O king, are a king of kings. For the God of heaven has given you a kingdom, power, strength, and glory. And wherever the children of men dwell, or the beasts of the field, and the birds of heaven, he has given them into your hand, and has made you ruler over them all. You are this head of gold."
And right there in the part that's not even prophetic, we have a failure. That clearly describes Nebuchadnezzar as the ruler of the entire earth. Wherever the children of men dwell, or the beasts of the field, or the birds of heaven, he has given them into your hands and has made you ruler over them all. I'm no historian, but I'm pretty sure that Nebuchadnezzar never conquered the Americas. Or Africa, or Asia, or Australia, or most of Europe. In fact, this golden head, biggest and best empire ever, didn't even make it onto Wikipedia's list of largest empires.
In other words, the head of gold represented the Babylonian Empire, since Nebuchadnezzar was the king of Babylon. But after you shall arise another kingdom, inferior to yours, then another, a third kingdom of bronze, which shall rule over all the earth. So we see this is predicting successive world-ruling empires. Babylon ruled from 605 to 539 BC. And the empire that came into power after Babylon was Medo-Persia, represented by the chest and arms of silver. And just as silver is inferior to gold, Medo-Persia wasn't as glorious as Babylon.
Now, what do you mean by glorious here? I mean, it was quite a bit larger. I couldn't find exact numbers for the area of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, but by looking at maps, the 5.5 million square kilometer Medo-Persian Empire actually contained the same territory as the Neo-Babylonian Empire, and it was larger than any previous empire in history. It also lasted a total of 220 years as opposed to Babylon's 87 years. It sounds a bit more glorious than Nebuchadnezzar's empire by the standards of glory usually used in this type of context in the Bible.
And it was a dual kingdom, a coalition of the Medes and Persians.
Sort of, for a bit. The Medes and Persians did work together with a few others to overthrow the Assyrian Empire, but Cyrus the Great rebelled against the Medes and eventually conquered them, and this is the event that marks the beginning of the First Persian Empire, which at this point I will mention that the only sources I can find that refer to a Medo-Persian Empire are biblical apologetic sites trying to make sense of this prophecy, and wanting to make it seem like this larger, longer-lasting, more glorious empire was just a coalition, so it wouldn't have actually been that big a deal compared to Babylon. Everyone else either calls it the First Persian Empire or the Achaemenid Empire.
Like the two arms in the statue. Not to mention taxes were paid in silver in Medo-Persia. Medo-Persia ruled to 331 BC and was succeeded by the Empire of Greece.
I wish you would use the proper names for these empires. That would make this a lot easier, as there was no Greek empire. What you mean, I think, is the Macedonian Empire, which did conquer the Persian Empire in 331 BCE, and included most of Greece in its territory, but the Kingdom of Macedonia actually existed before the Persian Empire defeated Babylon, so I'm not sure how that fits in.
Represented by the belly and thighs of bronze. Did you know that Greek soldiers wore bronze armor when they went out to battle?
And did you know that the Chinese soldiers of roughly the same time period used bronze swords? Just because the Bronze Age was over doesn't mean that the use of bronze went away. That's a relatively minor coincidence there. Bronze was still fairly commonly used.
Greece ruled until 168 BC and was conquered by the Roman Empire.
Okay, yeah, you were definitely referring to the Macedonian Empire. The Roman Republic forcibly abolished the Macedonian monarchy in 168 BCE. Though the Roman Empire wasn't a thing until 27 BCE, that's an easy enough mistake to make, so I can forgive you for that one. At least I don't have to hunt to find out what you were talking about for this one.
Talking about the Roman Empire, verse 40 says, "And the fourth kingdom shall be as strong as iron, inasmuch as iron breaks in pieces and shatters everything, and like iron that crushes, that kingdom will break in pieces and crush all the others." Iron is the strongest of the four metals in the statue Nebuchadnezzar dreamed about, and that illustrates the fact that Rome ruled longer than its predecessors.
Okay, that's nice, but if you recall, Nebuchadnezzar was supposed to rule over the most glorious empire of all the other ones, hence the head of gold. Rome, at its peak, had way more territory than Babylon could have ever imagined. I would venture a guess that most people, Westerners at least, if you asked them which empire in history was the most glorious, they would probably say the Roman Empire. Also, just as a matter of interest, when I posted this question on Twitter to check my hunch, the first response was a question of what is meant by glorious, so I'm not the only one that would feel more comfortable with this prophecy if there were actually specifics given. So now that some of the responses to my little Twitter question are in, 38 so far, I'll share the results. 13 of the 38 said the Roman Empire, so as expected, this was the most common answer, so that's 34% of them picked Romans. Tied for second are the British and Chinese empires with 5 each. Honorable mention goes to the Mongols, with 4 people saying they were the most glorious. Only one person picked out the Babylonian Empire, and that also happens to be the one person who had already seen this video and guessed that it was the one I was responding to when I asked, so that may have tainted the result. But my point is that of the 38 responses, only one person picked the golden head that was supposed to be Babylon as the most glorious.
Its rule lasted to 476 AD, and what happened in 476 AD is the Roman Empire was conquered by invading barbarian tribes who ended up dividing it into 10 territories. This division is spoken about in verse 41, which says, "Whereas you saw the feet and toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, the kingdom shall be divided, yet the strength of the iron shall be in it, just as you saw the iron mixed with ceramic clay."
But again, that's not very specific. Divided kingdoms were a very common thing back then. In fact, Israel and Judah have been divided for most of their history, with the possible exception of the time period from Saul's reign to Solomon's, although the archaeological evidence suggests otherwise. Also, the Macedonian Empire, which you said was represented by the bronze thighs, it ended by being fractured and being divided. Why no mention of that in the prophecy?
How much more precise can prophecy get? Rome was divided, not conquered, by another kingdom, just as the Bible said it would be.
Which is a very common end to empires. When Alexander the Great, who was responsible for expanding the Macedonian Empire, died, his generals basically took over the territories they had been in charge of while he was alive. When the guy holding power dies, the people that he placed in charge of the specific territories often make power grabs for those territories themselves. That's how a lot of these ancient military conquests ended. It is not specific to Rome at all.
The toes of iron, or 10 divisions of the Roman Empire, ended up developing into the modern nations of Europe. And Bible prophecy tells us they would attempt to unite with each other, but ultimately be unsuccessful.
So up until now, this has been a relatively unbroken line of conquest, with one empire conquering the next, which I could actually see as plausible. But you just jumped from 476 CE with the division and decline of the Western Roman Empire to the formation of the European Union in 1993, a jump of 1,517 years. There were several empires that existed within that time frame that could fit the prophecy as well. Let's start with the largest empire ever in history, the British Empire, which at the height of its power controlled almost a quarter of the landmass of the world. It also fragmented without being conquered, but even though it's no longer officially an empire, it still controls enough territory that the phrase, "the sun never sets on the British Empire," is still true to this day, thanks to the Pitcairn Islands in the Pacific Ocean, which are the only British territory to receive sunlight after the sun sets in the Cayman Islands, and before it rises in the British Indian Ocean Territory. So it seems to me like the British Empire is a better fit for the iron legs and the iron and clay feet, but we also missed the Mongol Empire, the Russian Empire, the Spanish Empire, the Ottoman Empire, several Chinese dynasties, including but not limited to the Qing Dynasty, the Yuan Dynasty, the Ming Dynasty, and more. Why did none of these empires fit the bill? Also, it is worth mentioning that since the prophecy specifically says that Nebuchadnezzar will rule over all the earth, that all of the empires I have just mentioned were significantly larger in size than anything Nebuchadnezzar ruled over.
Verses 42 through 43 say, "And as the toes of the feet were partly of iron and partly of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly fragile. As you saw iron mixed with ceramic clay, they will mingle with the seed of men, but they will not adhere to one another, just as iron does not mix with clay." There have been numerous failed attempts to unite the European continent throughout history. Those who have tried and failed include Napoleon, Kaiser Wilhelm, Mussolini, Hitler, and more recently, the European Union, resulting in Brexit.
Okay, so you started with Napoleon, which could be a reference to 1804, so you only jumped 1,328 years. My bad.
This is how Bible prophecy has outlined the rise and fall of world-ruling empires, even to modern times, which proves that God exists, because no one would be able to predict events so precisely and so far into the future.
Yeah, it predicted the world-ruling empires. It just skipped over all of the biggest ones. How accurate and specific. And at this point, I would like to go down another path, pointing out that scholars who don't start with the assumption that the Bible is divinely inspired, they tend to date the book of Daniel to much later than those who try to keep the prophecy intact. You see, Daniel does tend to have very accurate prophecies regarding the near future of the time that it's supposed to have been written, but when it makes predictions about events in the 2nd century BCE and later, it becomes incredibly inaccurate. It is thought by scholars that the prophecy with the statue is about the Neo-Babylonians' gold head, the Median Empire, silver chest, the Persian Empire, bronze belly, the Macedonian Empire, iron legs, and then the Hellenistic period where the Greek city-states fractured and formed several smaller kingdoms which then also colonized several areas in Asia and Africa. This is pretty close to what you have presented, but with a more plausible iron and clay fragmented empire. It also makes sense that the author would have been able to predict these events, as the likely date of authorship puts it right in the middle of the Hellenistic period. But if this is the case, then Christians can't use the apocalyptic passage that comes right after the statue bit, where it says that in the time of those kings, God will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed, that will crush all the kingdoms and bring them to an end, but will itself endure forever. As this suggests that if the Bible were accurate, God would already have set up a kingdom on earth that would rule the whole earth and last forever. And since no such kingdom came into being at the end of the Hellenistic period, that would make this an incorrect prophecy.
Fact number 2. DNA is more complex than a computer program.
Well, that depends on your definition of complexity. DNA is made up of nucleotides, all the components of which can form naturally. The main problem is finding out how these components could have combined into nucleotides in the prebiotic Earth. So the nucleotides themselves do not appear to be all that complex, and DNA is essentially just groupings of these nucleotide bases, which through fairly simple chemical reactions produce different proteins, which lead to life as we know it. Computer code, on the other hand, is incredibly complex. It's not as simple as coding out instructions and then the computer follows those instructions, because a computer essentially boils down to electricity flowing through a series of transistors, some of which will be on and others will be off. The computer only understands on or off, and so we can tell the computer what to do by sending combinations of ones and zeros to the processor to tell it which transistors to turn on or off at any given moment. But humans find it difficult to program in just ones and zeros, so we have programming languages which take different commands and translate them into ones and zeros for the computer, and then send the sequence to the computer's RAM, which then feeds it into the processor at the appropriate time. And then all of the parts of the computer work together to translate these electrical on-offs into the comprehensible patterns on a monitor. And this is a super-duper simplified version of what happens. I didn't even get into the cache, the graphics card, how specifically everything has to be calibrated in order to work together, how it works with the hard drive, different input devices, the capacitors, the bridges, the buses, and so on. My point is that depending on how you look at it, computer code can actually be more complex than DNA code.
People don't realize just how amazing our human DNA truly is. It's like an intricate computer program with a code number for each person that is 3 billion letters long.
And of those 3 billion letters, which are actually base pairs, so it's more like 6 billion letters as each pair is 2 letters, at least 1.5 billion of them could be discarded without ill effect. This is not the case for computer programs. Delete half the code of your operating system, and if you can even boot into it, I will be very surprised. This is the difference between evolved and designed. If our bodies were designed, then there should be very little waste and everything should be done as efficiently as possible. That's just basic good practice with coding. An easy example is to always store numbers and variables, even if you only plan on using it once, because in the future, when updating your code, it may become necessary to repeat the use, so it's much better to have a variable everywhere that it's in use, and if it needs to be changed, just change the initial declaration statement rather than having to hunt down every instance in the code. Our genetic code, were it to be compared to a computer code, has most of it commented out. That is, when coding, you can use a specific symbol to tell the computer that this part is not to be coded. This is usually used for making comments in the code or for debugging, turning off part of your code to see if whatever bug you're hunting down goes away when that part of the code is excluded. So in other words, if our DNA is a code that was programmed by someone or something, that someone or something is a terrible coder. This doesn't fit with the Christian God, which is supposed to be an all-powerful, all-knowing being, so should be able to know how to write code.
Think about that. And according to what science has learned, 99.9% of our DNA is identical.
Not quite. It's actually more like 99.4% similar. I don't see how this is a good argument for God, though. I mean, surely an intelligent designer would have scrapped all the unnecessary code, which, depending on which study you look at, could be anywhere from 50 to 98% of our genetic code. So let's split the difference at 75%, which is also a pretty good candidate figure according to some studies. If you scrap 75% of our base pairs, that leaves you with 750 million base pairs instead of 3 billion. Then the 20 million base pair difference between individual humans jumps from 0.6% difference to 2.67% difference. And that makes sense, considering that the vast majority of all our bodies are basically the same. 5 fingers here, 5 toes there, nose in the middle, ears on the side, head up, ass down, etc. So pointing to that figure just goes to show how useless most of our DNA is, which makes God look like an idiot when it comes to coding.
Dr. Francis Collins, director of the Human Genome Project, the one that mapped the human DNA structure, said that one can think of DNA as an instructional script, a software program sitting in the nucleus of the human cell.
Yes, you can think of it like that, because analogies help people understand things. That doesn't mean that it is a computer program, it's actually just a bunch of chemical reactions. DNA is read, protein is synthesized as a result, and depending on which proteins are synthesized in what order, different structures appear on the organism. All chemical reactions, not really a program, but close enough that it makes it easier for us to understand if we word it that way.
Perry Marshall, an information specialist, comments on the implications of this, stating, "There has never existed a computer program that wasn't designed. Whether it is a code, or a program, or a message given through a language, there is always an intelligent mind behind it."
Perry Marshall, the proponent of evolutionary creation, you mean? As in the Christian who accepts evolution but believes it was guided by God? I have much more respect for his position than for yours, because at least he can see the evidence for evolution is undeniable, he just thinks a god is behind it. And since evolution as a scientific theory makes no claims about the existence of a god, he's welcome to believe that. But I know that you are a young Earth creationist who does not accept the theory of evolution, so I wonder why you would bring him up as an authority here when you wouldn't accept his opinion on evolution as a whole.
That leads to the question of who wrote this script, and who placed this advanced code inside the cell. It obviously had to be an intelligent being, and that being, I present to you, is the eternal God. of the universe described in the Bible.
And like I pointed out, if God wrote our DNA, then he is a terrible coder who would have been fired for his inferior work on the species of the Earth. Maybe God is a low-level programmer and the flying spaghetti monster is his boss. His insecurities that are shown throughout the Bible would make sense then. Nobody at work has any respect for him, so he codes a planet full of life and demands that the most intelligent of that life worship him, or he'll send them to the hell that he coded for them. This needs to be a satire. Someone get on it.
Fact number 3. The Earth is designed to sustain life. There are numerous conditions that the planet needs to meet in order to sustain life that, if altered the slightest amount, would make that planet uninhabitable. And Earth meets all of those conditions. Coincidence? I think not. Let me give you a few examples. The Earth is just the right distance from the Sun. It's not too close and not too far. This is important because if it would be too close, then it would be too hot, and the heat of the Sun would boil up all of the water. And if we would be farther away from the Sun, it would be too cold and the water would freeze. But fortunately, the Earth revolves around in what is called the habitable zone of the Sun. This is a narrow zone where conditions for life are just right.
And in a study published in 2015, researchers found that most stars have 1 to 3 planets in their habitable zones. So this is all really nothing special.
In addition, the Earth rotates at just the right speed to keep one side of the planet from freezing from lack of sun and the other from becoming scorched by constant sun exposure.
And given the range of climates on the Earth itself, you don't think that life could have adapted to either constant sunlight or constant darkness? Everywhere we look on Earth, we find life, even in the most extreme environments like magma pits in the great depths of the oceans. And I think if the rotation were slower or faster, that wouldn't mean that life couldn't exist. It would simply mean that days are shorter or longer. In fact, the days are getting longer as the Earth slows down due to various external forces, the most notable of which is the Moon. Most simulations of the early solar system peg our day as being about 6 hours long 4.5 billion years ago, and the Earth has been slowing ever since. Our day gets about 1.7 milliseconds longer every 100 years, which doesn't sound like much but adds up over geologic time, and accounting for the fact that the Moon was closer to the Earth in the past, that would have had a stronger pull then, so it would have slowed down faster.
Then there's our atmosphere. It's around 21% oxygen, just the right amount for life.
Nope. Oxygen is actually toxic to life, including ours, which is why our bodies need to produce a certain amount of antioxidants. Life originally evolved in a much less oxygen-rich environment. In fact, when early life started producing oxygen as a waste product, this resulted in the first mass extinction event, which led to the rise of oxygen-dependent organisms. Take this next part with a grain of salt, as I can't find the source that I originally read this in, but I recall reading that this mass extinction event, while not the largest by percentage of species to go extinct, was the largest by biomass. Earth's atmosphere changes, and we have many ways of tracking it through geologic time, such as studying zircon crystals, ice cores, tree rings, and so on. So we know that the Earth has not always had the atmosphere that we enjoy today.
If there would be too much oxygen, then we would have raging forest fires everywhere and huge bugs, because a bug's size is proportionate to the oxygen in the air.
Interesting. We actually did have huge bugs in the past when there was a higher concentration of oxygen, but usually creationists pull that out as evidence for a different atmosphere before the flood. Does that mean that you don't accept this explanation? Because by your logic, that would mean that all the trees would have burned down, so Noah wouldn't have had wood to build an ark. But the fossils exist, so what's the deal here? Did God put them there to test us? We know enough about insect physiology to know that they couldn't grow that large without a more oxygen-rich environment, and you even said as much, so how did they?
If our oxygen level was too low, that could cause oxygen depravity, which results in nausea, fainting, loss of consciousness, and even death.
Yeah, in humans. There are plenty of organisms that can survive with less oxygen, most notably every plant ever, or anything that photosynthesizes. That's actually how we got our oxygen atmosphere in the first place.
These are just a few of the conditions necessary for life to exist on Earth. There are many, many more.
And I would assume that when leaving a bunch of conditions off the list, the ones you keep will be the ones that best support your position. And since you only mention things that we know either aren't all that important to life in general, for instance the rotation of the Earth and the oxygen in the atmosphere, or aren't that unique to Earth, the fact that we're in the habitable zone, we can therefore dismiss this section as irrelevant. Well, that's all for now. We'll see more of Bible Flockbox in Part 2. Remember to follow me on Twitter and Facebook and support me on Patreon. See you next time.